want to say that we are waiting for the organizers to give us the start because there is a delay in the previous event. Thank you.
Yes, we're ready.
Great.
All right, thank you all for joining. My name is Josh Clem. I'm the Policy Director at International Rivers. Thank you all for joining for this event that International Rivers, WWF, and TNC, the Nature Conservancy, have organized on the need for the resilience of rivers and exploring the ways to meet energy needs and meeting also the biodiversity needs and sustaining rivers. So we're really happy to have a distinguished panel here. Not everybody, unfortunately, is able to make it, so we'll have a couple gaps in our panel. But maybe we'll just go ahead and get started with Jeff Opperman from WWF, who'll be presenting remotely. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Let's see, am I sharing my slides yet? There we go, sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much. So I will be talking about a brighter future, tackling the climate crisis and protecting nature with the right renewables in the right places. And the vision that I'm going to be talking about is that we can power the world with power systems, electricity systems, that are low C times 3. And by that, we mean low carbon. And of course, that is an imperative. We're here at COP, so that is top of mind, that we need to decarbonize our electricity and, in fact, move much of other energy sources into electricity that would be powered by low carbon electricity. And we need to make sure these power systems are low cost. And by that, we mean economically competitive, because power systems that are not economically competitive are not going to be politically viable. So if we are trying to craft a future of these power systems that will actually work, we need to ensure that they are cost competitive. And low conflict. And by that, we mean low conflict with communities, with people, with rivers, and other ecosystems. So that's the vision, powering the world with systems that are low C times 3. And we feature that in these reports that have been done by WWF and the Nature Conservancy, a report called Connected and Flowing, and then most recently a online report, a microsite called A Brighter Future. So much of what I'm going to be talking about today is content and the main themes of A Brighter Future. And I'll repeat it again. The inherent question, the fundamental question we're asking is, can we meet the climate targets with power systems that do not have major impacts on people or nature? That's the vision. So our vision for how we get there is ensuring that we have the right renewables in the right places. So that's what we'll be talking about, this vision of how we get the right renewables in the right places to power the world through systems that are low C times 3. So here we have some of the graphics that come straight from the microsite, but this is the vision that will need to happen. We need to dramatically increase the proportion of electricity generation globally that comes from renewables. This is from a report from the International Energy Agency in 2021, showing what their models show we would need to do to hit the 1.5 degree target. In fact, it might have to be even more aggressive. This is just the power system. But if we electrify transportation and buildings, this might have to be larger. But for the purposes of this argument, we're showing what IEA is saying needs to happen by 2050. You can see a dramatic increase, primarily in wind and solar, and you may not really see what's going on with hydropower. So our next slide, we're zooming in on what's happening to hydropower. So hydropower is essentially doubling. Now, you didn't necessarily notice that because of how dramatic the increase was in wind and solar. Those are increasing by factors of 15 to 20 or something. But hydropower is doubling. And maybe that seems like it's a relatively small thing. Or let's say hydropower is doubling in this projection from IEA. There are other projections from IRENA. Many of the models that are used by IPCC include an approximate doubling of global hydropower capacity. So this is something that we want to focus on initially. What does this mean for our vision of low C times 3 power systems? What are the implications of this doubling of hydropower? So here's an image of a free-flowing river that's flowing into the ocean and forming a delta. And we want to focus on the value of multiple values of free-flowing rivers. So, and this is a great image of what free-flowing rivers provide. They carry sediments. They carry sediment from their entire river basin, and they deposit it in the low elevation floodplains and crucially in the deltas where they hit the ocean. Deltas worldwide and so deltas are landforms created by rivers and created and maintained by the sediment provided by free-flowing rivers. Deltas worldwide are home to 500 million people, and they produce 4% of all the world's agriculture on a fraction of a percent of the world's land. That's because deltas are phenomenally productive because of these nutrients and sediment that the rivers deliver. Rivers are also migratory highways for fish and other organisms that support the primary food for hundreds of millions of people coming from freshwater rivers and other systems. Now, dams, including hydropower dams, fragment these processes. The dams capture this sediment, and so rather than flowing down to the deltas, the sediment is deposited in the reservoirs. And around the world, deltas are sinking and shrinking, like the Mekong Delta, like the Nile Delta. So this is a major impact coming from hydropower dams, as well as impacts on migratory fish. And so conceptually, let's look at these large free-flowing rivers in the tropics. There are 120 of them. So each of these little symbols represents 4 large free-flowing rivers in the tropics. By large, rivers that are over 1,000 kilometers. These have the greatest share of the productivity, the ecosystem services, and the biodiversity of the rivers. So these are phenomenally important river systems globally. Now, already, about half of them have been dammed. So half remain free-flowing of these large tropical rivers, and about half have been dammed. The picture in the lower right is a great example of what happens to the sediment that's carried by rivers. So this is the Shreveport and the Saison rivers, major tributaries to the Mekong River. That is sediment that is going into a reservoir and is not available for the Mekong Delta. So what about the future? This is the past. This is hydropower dams and other dams have fragmented about half of all major free-flowing rivers in the tropics. But what about the future? So if you remember, I showed you that slide of what IEA was saying the total global capacity would be needed to meet climate targets by 2050. Well, translating that was capacity, this is generation. They're saying that capacity would support about 62,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity that is needed by 2050. 62,000 terawatt hours. So each brick here is, let's say, 1,000 terawatt hours. Now, of that, less than 1% is projected to come from planned future dams on these large free-flowing rivers in the tropics. So less than 1%. But what would that do? That would fragment half of the remaining free-flowing large tropical rivers, leaving only about a quarter large tropical rivers that are still free-flowing. So for less than 1% of the needed generation, renewable generation by 2050, we would lose half the remaining free-flowing rivers in the tropics, a major global ecosystem. So that, in our mind, is not consistent with a low C times 3 future because it is such a dramatic trade-off and negative impact from a small amount of renewable generation. Can we get that from somewhere else? Well, everybody here at this COP is fully aware of what's been happening with renewables, the dramatic wind and solar, the dramatic drop in cost. We've seen just in the past decade, dramatic, about 70% drop in the cost of solar. Wind, not quite so dramatic, but still an impressive drop. They are now at the bottom end of the cost of fossil fuels and cost competitive hydropower. So if before countries felt like they didn't have any other options than the trade-off of losing their free-flowing rivers, the renewable revolution means they clearly have other options. Now, the next question would be 15 to 20 times increase in wind and solar. Can we do that without conflict with communities and with nature? So this is another aspect that we focused on in the Brighter Future report. So these are maps from the Nature Conservancy's Site Wind Right program. What we see here is the central United States with a map of the wind speed. So this is the wind resource and how it's distributed. And then overlay that with a map of a range of important natural features, habitat and species distributions, migratory corridors, and the like. So we overlay these sets of resources, and what emerges are the sites that remain, the sites that are available for low conflict wind developments that aren't conflicting with all those other values. Now, what's remarkable is that this is more than the needed electricity, more than all the electricity needed in the United States. Now, of course, it can't all come from wind, but just as an order of magnitude, it's a dramatic amount that remains even after we filtered out all the sites that would have some conflict with natural resources. So what is the global potential of this? So let's revisit the 62,000 terawatt hours of renewable electricity that IEA says would be needed. Now, for this comparison, I have to shrink that down, but this is the same block that I'm talking about. So the global potential was explored in a paper by Baruch Mordo et al., led by the Nature Conservancy, and I was a co-author on this. And we looked at the full spectrum of low conflict sites around the world for wind and solar. And we found that there was 152,000 terawatt hours of these low conflict sites for wind and solar. So almost 3 times as what IEA is saying is needed for renewable electricity. So just to put this in perspective, I'm not saying that it's necessarily always easy, but the potential for finding low conflict sites should be out there because there is a very large pool of low conflict sites for wind and solar that can be used to power this vision of a low C times 3 world. And of course, we understand that at the scale of grids, we need to figure out systems that actually work. We have variable renewables, we need storage, we need dispatchable, we need grid integration, we need smart grids, we need all of these things. So we've been working with partners like the University of California, Berkeley, who are experts in modeling grids to understand how we can create these viable, realistic, low-cost grids. And in fact, we'll have other speakers later in this session talking about that. And we all have our part to do to make a low C times 3 future possible. Everybody has their part to do. And that's also what our other speakers today will be talking about. And we hope to engage in a dialogue with you. And I'll just close by putting up the URLs, the links to these microsites, Brighter Future, the overall site. And now it's been translated into French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and really look forward to this dialogue today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really excellent. Next, I want to introduce Benedict Bowie from Tmp Systems, who will share some work that they've developed around a tool called Riverscope, which is a recently developed tool that helps to assess the commercial risks and costs of environmental and social impacts. So, Ben?
Thank you very much.
Do you want to be here?
I'm happy to go here. Is presentation up? I believe so.
Oh. They can have to like.
We good? Great, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Oh, perfect. No, even better. It's great to have a physical audience indeed for the first time in quite some time. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you about Riverscope, which is a tool that we've developed to improve decision-making in the hydropower sector, specifically by paying closer attention to social and environmental risks. So this presentation will follow a simple three-part structure. I'll start with a problem statement about why we think there's an issue with the way that hydropower projects are assessed today, before going on to discuss our solution, which is Riverscope, a geospatial tool that we've designed to improve the decision-making process by taking greater account of ESG issues. And when you see ESG in this PowerPoint, it means environmental, social, and governance risks. And that's the term that's used by the financial community to cover these issues. So once I've described the tool in brief, I'll go on to discuss some of the key findings. That'll be the main part of this presentation. So, what's the problem with hydropower assessments in our view? These assessments do not pay sufficient attention to the complexities associated with environmental, social, and governance risks. These complexities take time and they take money to address. And the result of that is that many hydropower projects, in fact, most of them that we looked at, are severely delayed. Now, we think that developers have tried to address this problem by going to sites that they think will have lower social and environmental issues, i.e. in remote locations. Our research that covers 281 dams found that those remote locations were actually the highest risk from a financial perspective. I'm not talking about an ethical perspective, I'm talking about operational and financial perspective. These delays are long enough to create significant problems for hydropower projects, at a financial level and also on a political level. At a macro level, once you chain these problems together, you see that hydropower can create significant challenges in energy planning processes because it's so unpredictable. So, to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, I'm going to give you a quick preview of the results. And, clicked too far. And I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of things here. Here are the 5 pilots that we've applied Riverscope to so far. I'll give some more information on those in a bit. But you can see in the column on the right, we expect all of these pilot projects to be delayed by at least 2 years, in some case 3 years. And then you can see in the middle column, MPV loss. That creates significant losses in the valuations of these projects. I mean, an investor, private investor, will not go near a project that's 0% MPV. So any negative rating is extremely off-putting, to say the least. But this also changes the competitiveness of hydropower relative to alternatives. And so we can see here that each of these projects is likely to be considerably more expensive than solar once we account for all of the risks. But those calculations didn't actually factor in climate risks. It's based on a historical methodology that I'll go on to describe. Once we account for the impacts of climate change on water variability, which will result in reduced output for many hydropower projects, we see these results. And we can see that the effects of drought reduce the value of these projects by hundreds of millions in every case. And they have a considerable impact on the competitiveness, again, of these projects relative to alternatives that are less climate exposed. Oof. There we go, sorry. Having some problems with the clicker here. So just a little more information on the pilots that I just threw up. We've looked at 5 large hydropower projects. These are all in the planning and construction phases. We picked them with the help of international rivers because we believe they're representative, but they do also have some diversity between them. Some are run-of-the-river, some are impoundment. And by using this combination of pilots, we hope to show that Riverscope provides a viable way to do rapid and standardized assessments of hydropower projects that factor in ESG issues. So how does Riverscope actually work? So we start by trying to determine which dams are more risky than others. And we did this through a geospatial assessment process that covered 281 dams. What we did is we compared the geospatial characteristics of those dams that had reported to have significant problems and delays against those that had not had reported problems. Now, we do recognize there could have been problems there, but no reported problems there. And we used that comparison to derive 17 indicators social and environmental indicators that are statistically associated with increased risk for hydropower projects. And we can score each of those indicators on a 0 to 100 basis, and we can score the project overall on a 0 to 100 basis. This is the sort of quantitative data that financial decision makers need in order to change the way that they do business. We then plug the geospatial assessment into a financial modeling process. A simple discounted cash flow model shows how delays impact on the cash flows of the project and reduce its value. We then compare the levelized cost of electricity from the project, the risk-adjusted levelized cost of electricity, to locally available solar and wind alternatives. So they will be in the same country, or if we couldn't find good data on an in-country, from a neighboring country. So those should be representative values. And then finally, we do have a third stage of qualitative investigation to verify the outputs of the quantitative process. We know statistics can lie, but also to augment that quantitative process and look at issues that can be hard to deal with through a quantitative process. And so, leading on to the meat of this, what are the main results of our application of Riverscope so far? What we can see from this graphic is that hydropower takes an extremely long time to develop. In the best of all things being equal, hydropower will take double the amount of time of a large solar and wind project. But once you actually include these delays, you're looking at a lot longer. The average mean delay across the project we looked at was around a decade. I mean, that is extraordinary when we're talking about any planning perspective. And of course, that has a huge impact on the values. We saw, as you saw earlier from our table, all our projects had a reduction of MPV of minus 40% on average across the board. As I said, that's easily enough to deter any sensible private investor. These delays, as we say, drive up the levelized cost of electricity and make hydropower much less competitive than solar. And this graphic helps you to see how this works. The middle blue line is the most likely cost of electricity from the hydropower project, and the green line is solar. And what we can see is if this project comes online in 2030, as it's currently expected, it will already be 77% more expensive than solar. But if it is delayed, as it could be, as the distribution suggests is entirely possible, and it actually only comes online in 2040, it will be 150% more expensive than local solar alternatives or wind alternatives. And now turning to some of the environmental and social findings. And this is important because some development finance institutions use this as a rationale for supporting hydropower projects. But we found, sorry, excessive animation here. But we found that that hydropower projects had significant impacts at a local, regional, and global level. At a local level, across the pilots we looked at, over 50,000 people would be physically or economically displaced in each of these cases. Compare that to the official assessments, which suggest it will be more like 5,000 to 10,000 in each case. And we can see that the conventional assessment process is significantly underestimating displacement, the complexities associated with that, and of course the distress that will be caused to the people affected by it. But we also see these impacts at a regional level. And this is particularly clear in a region where we see a lot of hydropower development, like the Mekong, where we see significant impacts on food security that energy planners should be taking account of in their decision-making process. And finally, these issues that are obviously most important to the conference today, the connection between hydropower and climate change. Now, we know that hydropower can drive climate change through methane emissions. Eutrophication of reservoirs can lead to significant GHG emissions, but hydropower development in remote locations also leads to roads being developed to those locations, and those locations being subject to predatory activities from poaching to deforestation, and that's a well-established trend. But you cannot see this, but I'm sorry about that. But what we've also seen is that in the past 10 years, several countries have had significant shortfalls in electricity production because of droughts. that lead to reduced hydropower output. In Brazil, between 2013 and 2014, that shortfall was 15%. The IPCC tells us that those sorts of events are going to become more frequent and more severe. So we can expect that hydropower will become progressively more exposed to these shortfalls. And these are such large chunks of capacity that it creates a very serious headache for energy planners. My last slide, you'll be happy to know. So, our key findings here. What we found is that hydropower is extremely slow. And so if we're looking for urgent solutions to what is undoubtedly a pressing problem, then hydropower doesn't necessarily provide that. If you're thinking about planning a project now, it's unlikely to come online until 2030, 2035. I think we all know that the window of opportunity is closing too quickly. We also know that hydropower can often be a driver of climate change as well as heavily exposed to it. This creates problems at a project level and at a national level for financiers and for energy planners. We need to move towards a situation where costs are risk adjusted, and that will show that alternatives are not only competitive, but in many cases preferable. There may be some hydropower projects that are still viable, still competitive, but they need to be thoroughly assessed on these risks. Having proper early assessment of ESG risks can improve outcomes for all stakeholders, financiers, energy planners, and of course, the people affected by these projects. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Ben. So next, unfortunately, our speaker from a representative from the Zambian Ministry of Energy was unable to make it. So it's too bad, but hopefully we'll make up a bit of time. Next, we have Khan Gui from Green Innovation and Development Center in Vietnam. She won the Goldman Prize for her efforts to wean Vietnam off of hydro and coal in favor of renewables. So, Khan, over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Can I have a... Can you open? Yes. Yeah, so maybe while waiting for the technical setup, no, it's not mine. Maybe, yeah, I can start. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Khanh from Vietnam. I have nearly a half a decade to work to fight for river protection, and in my country and in the Mekong region. So we have spent a lot of time to discuss and to propose the Mekong government to delay the Mekong Dam development in the mainstream of the Mekong River, because we see that the growing of non-hydropower renewable is the alternative option for river life and also for the community resilience. With that belief, I set up Green ID in 2011, and we really focus on how to advocate and also accelerate clean energy transition with solar and wind in Vietnam. So how can I move this?
You have to ask.
Okay, it works now. Yeah, so I will skip the first part because the previous speaker has been mentioned about the global trend of the renewable development. I will focus more on the, yeah, why is it doesn't work?
Someone else, Francesca, is doing it online. Yeah, sorry. So you have to ask for the next slide.
Okay, so I think next slide, because this is about us. I has been mentioned already. So I need to I want to skip some slide talking about the global renewable development, because the previous speaker has been talked about it already. Okay, next, yeah, next one.
Yeah, I think she's on delay.
Okay, so yes, you see, the storage it is the solution for like variable renewable. It has been developed recently, and the cost projection it will go down very fastly. And I think our next speaker will talk more about this. So please skip it. Next slide. Yes. Yeah, you see here new solution coming in to address the problem of the hydropower and also create the maximize of the different renewable resources with like you see floating solution and also hydrogen. Next slide, please. Yes, and yeah, electrification of the transport means it also provides the solution to support for grid. Next, please. Yeah, it is the how renewable, non-hydropower renewable developed in Vietnam in the last 2 years. You may see that we provide some like figure from 2018. Solar is like not yet happened in Vietnam, but from 2019 to 2020, we have a like booming of the solar farm with about like 5,000 megawatt of solar farm achieved in by the end of 2020, and the next round of the solar development in Vietnam is solar rooftop. So by the end of last year, we got about like 16,000 megawatt of solar. Oh, it works now. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yes. So. You see, just from like almost zero, Vietnam become the like one among top 10 country leading the solar development. Yes, and then for wind, we also have a like a new development. The updated number I got yesterday is we just got 3,900 megawatt of wind solar connected to the grid, and the current power development plant projected to increase more renewable in the scenario by the next 10 years. However, this is not yet at the level of expectation. So from our alliance and from Green ID, we still try to advocate for further increase of renewable and also reduce more coal for the next 10 years, because we see that Vietnam have a lot of potential for solar, for wind, and also the other kind of like renewable solution like biomass, solid waste. This is the number of the like potential capacity, and you see that the action, the reality capacity is still very far from the potential. And in the Mekong Delta, we also witnessed a very quick development of the renewables, mainly solar and wind. Why I want to focus on Mekong Delta, because that you like listen from the previous speaker, the Mekong Delta were affected by like the cascade of dam developed in the uppers of the river, and with the proposal of about like 13,000 megawatt of power from hydropower, it will destroy our delta, and sediment will be blocked and trapped in the cascade dam. So we advocate for the delay of this project, and also we see that just in 2 years, our country can develop a lot of like solar and wind to meet our demand, and not sacrifice the river ecosystem, not like causing the impact for the downstream community. And as you know that it takes at least 10 years to develop a hydropower project. And with the 13,000 megawatt of proposed dam, up to now, I think there's only 2 projects start the construction. And also for the Sambor project, I think NHI has make analysis about the alternative option. It's taken into account, consider floating, combining with the existing dam in the brand of the river, it's a tributary of the Mekong River. It shows that it's more benefits if we developing the alternative solution based on the solar floating. So I think that we do not necessary to rely on the large-scale hydropower. It destroys the river and the sediment and the delta. So we have an alternative option. It's available now. So I think that is the message I want to share, and also highlight that with solar and wind, we just need 1 year or 2 years to be able to reach the capacity that we wait for 10 years already for hydropower in the Mekong River Basin. Yes, I remember it started from 10 years, right? And with 15,000 megawatt, but now for Vietnam, we just need 2 years to be able to have about, I think, 20,000 megawatt of solar and wind. I think that is the new opportunity for us to rethink the hydropower dam in the upstream of the river. And I would like to say that we have many solutions, and it's now financially available, not like 10 years ago. So it encourage us to reconsider the power plant in the Mekong region. And I also want to share some of the project we work with our partner at the community to encourage the solar for off-grid community. The solar combining with the agriculture I think it's a distributed solution, and it can deploy everywhere in any village in the Mekong region and in Vietnam. So it provides power for our need, but it also provides income for the farmer, and it it's not causing any trouble for the current grid. So I think that is a solution we need to consider. This is some image of our work and our project. We work with the people in the Delta and also in the other part of Vietnam. So we have a big hope for the future, because yesterday, I think 2 days ago, our Prime Minister has made a strong commitment for net zero by 2050. It's very ambitious, but we think that it's opened a new road for us to work together, and it's welcome for any effort it can support for Vietnam to reach to this target. And our Prime Minister also highlight the nature-based and science-based should be the principle for the transition. And also we need to have a strong commitment to reduce the greenhouse gas emission, but also at the same time need to ensure fairness and justice. I think this principle should also apply when we look again or rethink the hydropower development. Last but not least, I think that for Vietnam as a developing country, we need to have support and cooperation from international community to transfer technology, to enhance climate finance asset, and to support for deployment of renewable solution, non-hydropower renewable solution at both concentrated scale and distributed scale. So that is the last message I want to stop. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Khan. That was really great. Thanks so much for sharing your experience and the great work that you've been doing to shape the energy future of Vietnam. I think we all have a lot to learn there. So next we have a virtual speaker. We're lucky to have Lucia Giessen from Swiss Re, who will be presenting about how Swiss Re is tackling the challenge of decreasing how to decrease business risks that impact nature. So Lucia, hopefully you're with us and able to take us through it. We can't wait to hear what you have to say. Thanks.
I am. Thanks a lot. And also thanks a lot for having me here. So as mentioned, I'm a sustainability risk manager at Swiss Re. So for those who are not familiar with Swiss Re, it's a global reinsurance company. So we provide insurance coverage to corporates, but as well to insurance. So that's why reinsurance. And what I'd like to show you now is how we manage sustainability risk with a special focus on hydro dams. So on the next slide, you can see that sustainability had been an important topic for Swiss Re since many years. So we've already published our first report related to sustainability at the end of the 20th century. I don't want to highlight everything on this timeline, so I will focus on later on the ESG Risk Framework, which you can see was developed in 2009. And I think what is also important to mention related to ecosystems and biodiversity is the Biodiversity and the Ecosystem Service Index, which was developed in 2020 by my colleagues, so by the Swiss Re Institute. So on the next slide, very briefly about this Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Index. Briefly, it's called BES Index. What it shows you is the current state of biodiversity and ecosystems globally. So with that, you can compare regions or countries, and coupled with the dependency of different economic sectors, it also shows the exposure of national economies related, or the exposure of national economies to biodiversity losses. On the next slide, I would like now to walk you through our ESG risk framework. So ESG, as mentioned before, relates to environmental, social, and governance. And these frameworks allows us to manage and identify ESG risk across our entire organization. So it's not only for underwriters or what we insure, but it's also for the investment side. And it consists of 3 umbrella guidelines, one on environment, social, human rights, and the last one on governance. And it also consists of sector-specific policies, which you can see on the right side. So these are sectors which are most material to our business. And one of these sector-specific policies is hydro dams. Besides these policies, we also have a list of companies and country industries which we exclude. And now I would like to focus more on the hydro dam policy. So on the next slide, each of these sector-specific policies is structured in the same way. So first, we define for our business what are the key material risks. And then within these key material risks, we define clear exclusion criteria. So criteria when we say we are not providing business support. And in the hydro dam policy, so key material risks are for us the rights of local communities, also labor rights during construction regarding health and safety, or any other rights outlined in the 8 ILO conventions. And then regarding the environment, we look at the impact of the dam on biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as on the impact on neighboring countries and on cultural heritage. Regarding exclusion criteria, so as mentioned before, a clear no-go for us would be a violation of one of the 8 ILO core conventions, such as forced labor, or violations of rights of local communities. So for example, what we see often is that indigenous peoples do not benefit from free, prior, and informed consent, or it comes to forced or uncompensated relocation. So this would also be a no-go for our business support. And for any new large-scale hydropower project, we also request an environmental and social impact assessment. And we also do not support projects which are located in a protected area. So, for example, bird heritage sites, or if the project is located in an IUCN protected area, category 1 to 4. On the next slide, I'd like to show you how this policy is implemented in practice. Sorry, it's a bit small, but basically, whenever a client reaches out to us for business support, the deal goes through a screening. So there is a first initial screening of every transaction. It is screened for ESG risks, and it's called the ESG Risk Management Service. So it's step 3 on this graph, and it can give 4 different outcomes. So one is low risk. We don't see any risk for sustainability risks. Medium risk, here we see potential impact of the transaction on people and the environment. So here the underwriter is required to conduct due diligence. So, for example, check if there is any negative news regarding this hydropower dam. In the case of high risk with severe risks, so then it's transferred to our team. And the 4th potential outcome is an abstain, because the project, we already know the project, and we know that it's harming the environment severely or local communities. And this high risk, so now on the graph, step 4, there is the second tool which comes into play, the ESG risk referral tool. Basically, that's my team. So we analyze the transaction in more details, and we can then also issue 3 different recommendations. These recommendations are binding. So the underwriter has to follow our recommendations. And on the next slide, I would like to show you how these different recommendations can look like. So one is proceed, the other is proceed with condition, and the last one is an abstain. So in the case of proceed, for example, we are asked to provide insurance to a new hydropower project in Nepal. And we then check this project on our external data provider. And in this case, we haven't found any controversy. And we also have access to a publicly available independent environmental and social impact assessment, which is in line with external best practice. So here we issue a proceed. The second potential recommendation we can give is a proceed with condition. Here we make our coverage conditional, because normally every transaction is renewed after 1 year. So, for example, if we see that there were issues in the past, but now there is a positive trend, the company engaged with the local communities, really tried to solve the issues, we see a positive development, and then we can, for example, say we can give you this coverage, but we want to see that this is really on a positive path, and you can only renew this transaction if the positive trend continues. So basically here we have really the power or the leverage to engage with the client, share our concerns, make them aware that we care about sustainability. And the last case is an abstain recommendation. So it could be that the project is located in a protected area, and then it's a clear no-go for us. So there is no room for improvement. On the next slide, this is already my final slide. So I just wanted to mention what is important for us, and I guess for many other stakeholders as well, is data. So the more robust environmental and social data we have, and the more external assessments we have, the better we can really manage sustainability risks. And I think this was very well outlined before by Benedict from Tmp Systems. So I think these Riverscope assessments could really help us. So if we know the location of the project, and the project is really at the wrong place, so no matter how good the performance is, we can already decline these projects, or that we know that there have been massive relocation of local communities, or also regarding environmental issues, that there are a lot of greenhouse gases, then we can already say we don't want to provide business support to this project, and we can put it on our project list. That's all from my side, and thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Lucia, for an excellent presentation. It's great to hear how actors within the private sector are also looking at sustainability issues, and in some cases, in some of the policies that you mentioned, even surpass those of even development financiers and others who are supposed to be kind of leaders in environmental and social governance. So thank you so much for that. So last but not least, we have, certainly not least, we have Dr. Dan Cammon from the University of California at Berkeley. Now will be joining the Biden administration in his capacity working for Power Africa and the USAID. Dan is very much a pioneer in efforts really to help countries to identify viable renewable energy solutions and alternatives to damaging centralized projects such as coal and hydropower. So, Dan, we're really glad that you're here, and we can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I guess I should come over. Is that okay? Okay. Well, we'll see if this see if it works. So my thanks, and I guess I'm the only thing now. It's speaker number 5 that stands between you and coffee, tea, next event. So I get the also have a Q&A. And the Q&A. Okay. So I have the kind of the fun role to try to talk about what I would say is the positive lessons out of these efforts and some really dramatic steps forward. And so the 2 hats that I wear are kind of useful for this. My lab, as you mentioned, has been working in partnership with a number of governments in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, for a number of decades. But at USAID and at Power Africa, we'll be making a number of funding announcements tomorrow on Energy Day, and I urge you to kind of keep that in mind. There's a few things I can't spill the beans on today to make it a little more exciting for tomorrow, but the numbers are big. They involve the B word. And so the feature of this back and forth I want to highlight is that in all the talks you heard, both in person and virtual, there was a very important common theme, and that was open source, transparent, data-based models consistently favor sustainable solutions from the perspective of reliable power systems, more reliable as climate change gets worse, which unfortunately is happening, more reliables in terms of ESG and in terms of human rights and in terms of biodiversity. And so instead of running through a great big modeling picture, which as an academic I love to do, and I have 9,000 slides to prove it, what I want to highlight are only some cases that illustrate the stories in their fruition. I think there's one element that all of the speakers talked about, but I want to emphasize it because it often doesn't come across quite as strongly, and that is these analytic tools are great. I'm a physicist by training. I love building analytic models, but in none of the cases I'll highlight here were they success stories until there was a strong social justice, civil society component that utilized and reformed how the analytics were done, used, and brought into action. And so if I just start with some cases in my home state of California, I will move quickly to developing countries, but I want to highlight both sides of it. This is kind of, I would argue, this is one of those, pictures of the Anthropocene. This is the Grand Coulee Dam in Southern California. This is when I was an undergraduate, and this is today in terms of just the horrific change. And just one item beyond the massive drought that we are in California is that the feedbacks are insidious and horrific. So one of the many feedbacks is that with our massive drought and our massive wildfires, helicopters can no longer safely get water out of the dams to fight fires. And that is not the only one, but since we in California, and now in Australia, and now in Siberia, and now in Greece, have created a fifth anthropogenic season, right? That fifth season, we used to have winter, summer, spring, autumn. Now we have that in the fire season too. And so I highlight that these damages compound each other. And so we're not sick of, but we have to recognize that the severity of these damages are well described in the IPCC reports. This is just how much worse all the metrics will be if the 1.5 degree target is surpassed, for which many sane people think we have little chance. And right behind us is the 1.2, or a little bit higher where we're at today. And so highlighting all of these issues very quickly, in the California case, our 2010 goal was to be 20% powered by renewables. We missed that goal. We didn't hit it until 2013. The numbers have gotten, the 2020 is the middle. Sorry, they're shifted over by one. Our 2020 goal was 1/3 powered by renewables. We are well over 40% today. So we exceeded that goal despite starting late. The 2030 goal was 50%. It's now been increased to 60% of our energy from renewables. And of importance in California, large hydro and nuclear do not count in our clean energy mix. So you might say, well, California is a special, very affluent case, but I want to highlight what that means in terms of action today, 2021, before moving to developing countries. So if I can press the pointer right, this is one day in April of this year, and the green line is the mix of renewables. I guess I can't pointer on the screen. But what you'll notice is that not only did imports from neighboring states go negative, we started to export power, hydropower became essentially an irrelevant point of the mix. 30 years ago, California was forecast to be a state powered almost entirely by nuclear and large hydro. Neither one is relevant in our mix today, except for the load following and the pumped hydro storage elements to build up the storage to support wind and solar. And I highlight this because if our 2030 goal is to be 60% powered by renewables, we're hitting 95% on the best days today in 2021. That doesn't prove the overall mix, but it highlights a very different world to be moving into. To highlight the developing country versions of the same story, they are essentially versions of the same thing. And so recently in joining Power Africa, one of my jobs is to work on this exact story you've heard all the speakers highlight. How valuable these open source models can be, particularly in places with vertically integrated utilities that don't often, to put it mildly, give a huge space for civil society and other input. Building these modeling tools in the hands of community groups, university groups, public-private partnerships can really change that dialogue. And so again, this is sort of an extended business card, if you will, from my new office at Power Africa to work on engagement around clean energy solutions. So let me simply turn to several examples of where this dialogue really illustrated the message we talked about here. So my own laboratory builds one of these power systems models, just like you heard from several other speakers. My own model is called Switch. I happen to love it and of course slaved over it, but all of these models are essentially as good and useful as the data input and the transparency. So my own is called Switch. We first used this in the case of Kenya, where there is an active debate about a coal-fired power plant proposed for the coast, city of Lamu. And developing the modeling tool showed very clearly that in this East African case, the mixture of solar, wind, and geothermal was a far cheaper solution, like you heard from Jeff Opperman's opening talk onwards. But that modeling effort would have gone essentially nowhere if the civil society groups working through the justice system in Kenya, working through community groups, there's a group called Save Lamu, there's a group called Decolonize, didn't take those results and really bring them into a much broader social dialogue. the Lamu plant that was primarily to be funded and built and support by a mixture of Chinese banks and an American company, General Electric, that project has been canceled. There is an ongoing battle about it, but that project is currently off the agenda. Very similar story in East Malaysia, in Sarawak and Sabah, 2 states on Borneo, where the same modeling package was made directly available to community groups, to city governments, and in their dialogue, it was one of the tools. And I can't rate whether community activism or the analytics was better or worse. I think this is really like saying, which of your children do you love more? They're all critical in the story, but this is a case where one of the mega dams proposed for Borneo, the Baram Dam, was canceled as a result of community groups using these tools directly in their analytics. In fact, in Malaysian Borneo, there is a series of these mega dams called SCORE, cleverly named, I would say, the Sarawak Corridor for Renewable Energy. It's essentially a menu of $10 billion gigawatt dams, the first one of which in this line has now been canceled as a result of this dialogue, information-based, but very much a community management process. So individual projects are fine. The question is really where you go from that. And I would say the next stage of the process, I will return to Africa, where, again, watch for the announcements made tomorrow by USAID and several large foundations and several of the billionaires often in the news. And that will be on an effort to fund at a much larger scale than we've seen before, a very large investment in mini grids, but the term mini is probably no longer an appropriate piece. In 2 very contested regions, one in Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo and one in Malakal in South Sudan, in each cases, the mini grids being constructed now are more than a megawatt per mini grid with enough on-site storage to either power the local community for several days, or in the South Sudan case in Malakal, to power the relief camp for several days. And when the hope for violence subsides and peace grows, that will become a clean energy power plant tied to the city. So each of these megawatt scale projects are essentially larger instantiations, larger versions of these community efforts built outwards to provide immediate energy sources, but ultimately to become clean energy hubs on the grid. So again, watch tomorrow's announcement where the B word will come into play. To return briefly in my last minute or two to the work in Southeast Asia, I just highlight an effort here to work with the largest technical society in the world, the Society of Electrical Engineers, and we recently published a book of these case studies of development distributed alternatives to large centralized mega projects. And in a recent effort in Laos, exactly what you heard before. And this is a project with Jeff Opperman, the first speaker, where mapping out the proposed projects, and these were largely projects that were going to be financed to export power to a large regional power, that essentially doing these cost-benefit assessments with engaged community groups armed them to look at the clean energy options. This is a paper in Nature, so it's both easy to find and it's open access. And it highlights a series of projects. You can see the built projects are the dark circles, the proposed dams in the Mekong are the open circle projects. And this really highlights, I think, how these tools can be put into play. My last comment to kind of look how this kind of works together is that every country, every region is doing its own individual battle. Should they be looking at a cap and trade market for a price of carbon? Should they be looking at a carbon tax, a cap and dividend? I just want to highlight where the dialogue has gone in the United States over this. And this is to jump over many of these individual market requirements by, at the federal government level, instituting a requirement that all federal agencies that then have to work with their state and local agencies in kind of a pyramid are now being tasked by President Biden to utilize the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon 10 years ago was kind of the academic's dream. 5 years ago, it became a national commission in the United States, in parts of the EU. And the social cost of carbon includes an assessment of both the climate impact and the human rights and justice impact of fossil projects. And so again, I'm going to close with this kind of pointing to the new metrics that are evolving at the highest financial levels. This is something that for our case, the Secretary of Treasury will be the one to implement. And this is really an effort to make the accounting that you've heard from all of the speakers part of this overall assessment. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank our hosts, and just to highlight, if you want any of the analytics or the Twitter where I'll be talking about this and then the big announcement we'll make tomorrow, I just want to thank you, and I want to thank our hosts, but in particular the speakers, for really highlighting how critical it is to look at the analytics and how I believe the analytics story arms you for a fight. It doesn't win the fight. That's the social justice part of the story. So thank you all, and I look forward to our Q&A.
Thank you, Dan. Always great to hear your thoughts. So we've got 10 minutes left. So for kind of final facilitation and wrap up, we have Mark Lambrides from the Nature Conservancy. So Mark, you want to come up and I'll hand you the mic.
Thanks so much, Josh. And in particular, I want to thank the speakers. And Dan, you did a good job of highlighting some of the important points from the session today, so I won't go over that. I really appreciate from virtual, Jeff, you starting us off with some thoughts on really the economic and environmental challenges associated with hydro, but that the very critical ways to consider the alternatives, whether it be hydro, well cited, or alternatives to hydro altogether with solar and wind, and the importance of also looking at the impacts of those systems as they touch down on the ground. And Ben, for the important remarks on Riverscope and the use of that tool, Han, for the really thoughtful interventions on Vietnam and some of the critical elements and choices that you have to make in that case. And online, Louisa from Swiss Re, really important institution for a long term in considering the environmental and social risks and putting their money behind it in this case. And finally, Dan, starting off, I thought great, opening us up to both considerations of energy, which is now needs to be open, data-based, transparent, and importantly, reliable. And I'd add to that the cost effectiveness of the renewable energy solutions that we are experiencing today. So given the late hour and the overrun, I'm going to allow for one question, and I was told there is one in the audience. I'm going to turn it over to the gentleman in the back, who is a rapporteur from the UN in the water and sanitation arena. I can make sure a mic comes your way. And so if you could ask one quick question, and I'm going to then turn it just to the speakers who are live, if you wanted to take a minute to respond to this important question, please.
Yes. No, just I wanted to explain you that in the last days we have published a statement, a joint statement with 4 special rapporteurs of the United Nations on one question. We have 20 years from the report of the World Commission on Dams. And it's a good moment for remembering that in that moment it was some specific data, such as, for instance, between 40 and 80 million people flooded and expelled from their houses and their territories. First thing, more than 400 million people gravely, severely affected downstream. So when this data, we cannot forget it, and we continue to have this kind of threats at present with a new wave of hydropower big dams, you know. So from my point of view, for our point of view from the United Nations, we are asking the governments to reflect. This is not the right way. This is not green energy. because they produce grave social impacts and very grave also environmental impacts on sustainability in the rivers and so on. So in that sense, at the end, just two of the several recommendations. We say call on governments to ensure independent reviews of dams to ensure fair compensation to affected people and guarantee human rights to drinking water, sanitation, housing, food, health, and education. And another point says, call on governments, the power generation industry, and financial institutions to halt planned new large hydropower dams and prioritize the optimization of the existing dams and the development of other renewable energies with lower social and environmental impacts.
Thank you for that. I don't know that we have answers to that other than maybe voices of support, because I think that's really consistent with what we have heard today. So I think we're going to move towards wrapping up. And so just to remind everybody today, where Jeff started out, a lot of this information can be found on the recently launched website called brighterfuture.org, on which we really highlight some of the technical challenges. There are links in there. You can look at some of the solutions. Dan mentioned Switch and the tool that they've got developed. You heard of Riverscope, the Nature Conservancy. We've produced an important product called Hydro by Design, which helps governments in particular and large institutions. IFC is using this tool right now to consider the basin scale analysis, alternatives for hydropower development, really focusing, if you have to build new hydro, on cascades or other low impact opportunities around the world. So I would invite you to look at that through Brighter Future or directly on Hydro by Design at nature.org. But other than that, I just want to thank our co-hosts, co-organizers on this, International Rivers, and our friends at WWF. This has really been a fascinating session. I thank everybody for staying with us at this late hour. So again, let's put an end to this and thank our speakers.